It was Canada's longest war ever, and this was the battleground, a line north-south through Europe, behind which, fingers on the trigger, the greatest forces ever assembled faced each other. While Canadians went about their day-to-day business, 4 generations of their sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, fought a desperate war in this land.
Zero, this is 5-7. I have 4 unidentified fast flyers.
It took 40 vigilant, battle-ready years to win this war, and not a shot in all that time was fired in anger. Today, their mission is accomplished. Peace is preserved. The Cold Warriors are coming home.
General Jodl, the representative of the German High Command, and of Grand Admiral Dönitz, the designated head of the German state, signed the act of unconditional surrender of all
1945.
German land,
For the second
sea,
time this
and
century,
air forces in
the
Europe.
world witnesses the end of a war, to end all war. The joy of peace, hard won, comes heavily dosed with relief. Never, never again is the universal resolve.
An iron curtain has descended across.
Yet the dogs of war are barely chained when conflict once again threatens to loose them. A new line is drawn across the world, this time between ideologies, and the swords begin to rattle. A new war begins, a war like none before, a call to arms but not to conflict, a war which dangles the carrot of peace between a balance of power on either side too awful to invoke. A precarious peace which would be maintained for over 40 years before the Cold War was won. And Canadians would play a pivotal role. As a member of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, Canada agreed that the most immediate threat to world peace lay in Europe and the Soviet-backed Warsaw Pact nations. Along with our NATO allies, we decided to deploy defensive forces, first in England, then in France and Germany. Over the years of the Cold War, a variety of Army and Air Force units were stationed in Europe, part of an enormous, coordinated NATO commitment, strategically located, deterring war by being ready for it. The air base at Baden-Sollingen was typical of Canada's presence. It was on September 4th, 1953, that the 1st Canadian Squadron arrived here in southern Germany. Today, 40 years later, the base is scheduled to close. And those who served here are coming back for one last get-together.
This is Air Canada and Canadian Airlines, and for this weekend we've declared a truce and we're still talking to each other.
And not just the Canadians. NATO allies are coming too. Those with whom they trained and flew and shared the combat-ready price of peace. For us, this reunion at Baden becomes a microcosm of Canada's presence in Europe. A chance to meet some who served and share their memories.
Sad occasion. Certainly there's going to be some revelry this weekend as people celebrate the remembrances of days gone by and renew acquaintances with people they haven't seen for a lot of years. But I can assure you come Monday when the parade is on, there won't be too many dry eyes in the place.
But it's a historic event. It's not a rehearsal. This is the real thing.
We have all our NATO friends in here. All the Tiger squadrons from all over Europe have made it. And we have a camaraderie that we are at Tiger Meet this year in Albacete, Spain. And it's everybody comes from all over Europe, all the Tiger squadrons. You all get together, you have a common association, and they do some great flying. I mean, some fantastic flying. It's still pretty amazing we get paid to do this, though.
They fought a war of technology and readiness to use it. A neck-and-neck arms race with peace as the prize, if neither side won. Back in 1953, and for 10 years at Baden, Canadians flew the F-86, the famous Sabre, built under license by Canadair in Montreal. It was considered the hottest fighter on Earth at the time. Within the mosaic of NATO defenses, the Sabres at Baden were assigned a sector and a tactical role: high altitude, daylight interception, search and destroy enemy MiGs. For Canadians back home, the F-86 was an occasional thunder in the sky, which reached a crescendo with the spectacular Golden Hawk's aerobatic team. Looking back, the Sabre years were good ones for the men and women serving at Baden. Combat readiness at the brink of the apocalypse became routine.
Well, I was here at Baden when the first Sabres arrived. I was at Three Wing at the time, at Zweibrücken, and we came down for the fly-in. That was in 1953, September of 1953. And I guess we were a bit cock of the walk because we were flying what we thought was the best airplane in the world, and we were very happy to be in a position to try to... I was convinced at the time I joined the service that we were going to be in the Third World War because this was the time of Korea. And of course, fortunately, that didn't come to pass, so it worked out well. But people were pretty dedicated because they were thinking very much of the wartime years.
Remembering back, I first started flying it when I was 19 years old. And an airplane like the Sabre, which most people said was the Spitfire of the jet age, it was rather exciting to get on it. The Sabre didn't have any missiles on it. It was one of the reasons why we upgraded to the 104 when we did, to the Starfighter. The Sabre only had a gun, and it became outmoded, it became obsolete, or at least obsolescent. But it was a day fighter with a gun, in fact 6 guns.
I look at things now, and that's 25 years ago now, and when I look back and think of how things were when we were living in, not me, but my troops were living in tents up until this time of the year, and getting very worried about them because their children were trying to do their homework under canvas with temperatures like this and in the pouring rain. It was a disaster area. However, we sorted it out quite quickly and got them into hotels and guest houses and so forth. But those were the tough parts.
With every Cold War crisis, and there were many, the temperature rose. Who would blink? Would the order come? Behind the tension, the endless deadly war games in labs and factories far away, the race for arms supremacy accelerated. In the spring of 1963, the first of a new generation of jets arrived at Baden. Destined to supersede the Sabres, it could fly at Mach 2+, and was assigned a different tactical role: streak in and strike at low level with nuclear weapons. Enter the Starfighter. The CF-104, the Starfighter, was designed to leapfrog technology the Soviets were developing. The decision to build and deploy it was taken by the Canadian government in 1959, 4 years before it arrived at Baden. With it came a new generation of Canadians, pilots and ground crew.
Well, it was brand new at the time, and going along at, 200 feet at .85 Mach was pretty thrilling already.
Initially, the 104 was brought over as a strike attack aircraft carrying a nuclear weapon, and a couple of squadrons were straight recce, photo recce squadrons. That changed after about 10 years of service in the early 70s to a ground attack role, back to conventional weapons, but low level as opposed to the high level that the Sabre used to do.
Everybody described it as the Cadillac, and it was an airplane that I described to people. I said I just enjoyed taxiing the airplane. Flying it was a benefit on top of that.
Within days of its arrival, the work of bringing the 104 up to operational speed got underway. Training was intense and under constantly changing demands, unending.
You know, when we got into the 104 business way back in 62 or so, we purchased the aircraft as a nuclear strike bomber, and it was a very, very viable in that role because you only had to carry one weapon. And in 1970, with the government decision to get out of that role, went to conventional ground attack. Now, with the size of the 104 and the very short wingspan, you had a very limited capability. But I think we did present something that was viable. We worked really hard on the tactics in addition to our NATO allies, but it was basically a conventional daytime attack with bombs, rockets, guns.
When you were back in Canada, I mean, I don't think you really understood it until you started flying here and realized that the inter-German border was only 12 to 14 minutes flying time away, depending on which part you were heading for. And the fact that we would come in on snowball exercises and we would pull out the actual missions that we would have flown had a war broken out, it drove it home to you very quickly that this was serious business and that people had to be prepared. Snowballs were the routine recalls that we used to have, and basically the criteria that were laid down was we had 2 hours from somebody blowing the horn here to generate 70% of our strength in situ at work in what we call the wartime place of duty. And so these would happen at various times in the day. Normally it was 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and we had a system of pagers and a fan-out list. People would phone around and they'd start pouring through the gates, and we would actually upload the aircraft with the weapons that we would fly. We would go to our squadron bunkers, we would brief the missions that we would have flown, and then once the aircraft had been accepted and we had met the personnel requirements, we would then call it off. We then had another kind of exercise which we call starfighters, where we didn't fly with the real ordnance, but we would basically go into a 2 or 3 day wartime scenario and exercise all aspects of the base for whether it be general defense forces, the actual flying of the missions, the repair of the aircraft. It was very intense training.
This was serious business. Hard for us to imagine today. Daily, with deadly diligence, these Canadians in Germany, just a few kilometers from an enemy, similarly armed and bent on world domination, ate breakfast, kissed wives and kids goodbye, and went to work. Ordnance loaded, flight checks done. They rolled off the flight line for the runway and the day's mission. They took off in a demanding, unforgiving machine. The CF-104 was dubbed Widowmaker by many who never flew it. An extremely critical weapon of war by many who did. They flew the frigid border between East and West, between peace and Armageddon, as if it was a milk run.
Hostile, north to south, 10 miles.
They were the last of a breed, these pilots. The last on whose skill the delivery of weapons would directly depend. They flew the crest of the Cold War, at the leading edge of the arms race, until, after over 20 years in service, something new, something deadlier, was coming up fast behind the CF-104. After much debate, in which Soviet technology loomed large, not to mention the effectiveness and safety of Canadian pilots, Canada selected the CF-18 to replace the 104. It first appeared at Baden in the spring of '84 on a visit. In 1986, the first operational Hornets arrived.
The F-18 is such a magnificent aircraft in terms of capability that I was very proud of our selection. I think every fighter pilot in the Canadian Air Force believed, perhaps for the first time, that the pilots had been listened to and that we bought the airplane that we really needed, that all the guys felt was the right airplane. Now, my wife, of course, looked at it from a slightly different point of view, because when I came home and told her, what airplane we were buying and showed her a picture, she said, I suppose it's really good, but it's not sexy like the 104. I mean, the 104 kind of looked like it was doing Mach 2 even when it was standing still on the ramp. And I guess there's a certain amount to that. The F-18 looks more like a fighting machine, and that's truly what it is.
With it came nostalgia for some, and a new breed of pilots who loved it.
104, we could run like hell from anybody. This thing, we go get them, and that's the big difference. Got a great radar, great radar warning receiver, great missiles, a good airplane. 104, we start off with how many? 220 or something like that, and we lost 110 of them. Now, it was a dangerous mission with the low-level stuff. But a lot of it, engine failure, take a bird down or something, the engine quits. Well, with one engine, you're stepping out. The Hornet, no problem, you got two engines, as long as you don't hit two birds, I guess.
Suddenly, Canadians in Europe were flying a machine laced with near-cybernetic technology. It extended their senses, presenting situations instantly, accurately, reacting on command like no machine they had ever flown before. Such speed, such versatility of tactics and weaponry, such deadly potential could give NATO the edge. As the 1980s drew to a close, the resolve of the Soviets began to falter. Many influences were the cause: economic, intellectual, internal and external. But not least was the unremitting determination of NATO, of 4 generations of Canadians, to keep the peace in a balance of terror too awful to invoke. "40 years ago, they came as conquerors to a defeated land. Today, they prepare to leave as friends." Over the years, tens of thousands of Canadians have served in Europe, many of them here in Germany at Baden. For years, nearly 25% of the people living here were Canadians, 1 in every 4. And most local folk have never known life without them.
It's really, as we would say in German, zweite Heimat, the second home we have. And we have a very, very close attachment to the people, to the land, to the customs that are there. And you'll find that in even places like Cold Lake, where you have a lot of Canadians who have spent time in Europe, that they import these things back, and that it's not lost. That our lives are irrevocably changed, I suppose, by the fact that we've been exposed to this different part of the world.
In my time when I spent here, there are 6 base commanders, and everybody was like my best friend in German, always. And when I see them now, to go back, it's hard for me.
NATO is changing. It is changing, and it will continue to change, and we, I guess, should be very, very thankful that the Cold War is over, and we are now closing bases, which is what we really all hoped would happen one day.
Well, I think that everybody should be very proud of what the Canadian Forces and the RCAF have accomplished here in Germany. I think our contribution, although it was small, I think it was significant. We did a really good job, I feel, and people should be aware of that and they should be proud of it.
Well, it's very sad, I think, to watch these units be disbanded and sent back to Canada. On the other hand, I also believe that it's correct. I mean, with the Cold War having basically ended, I think it's incorrect for Canada to have forces stationed on German soil, and I think the Germans feel that as well. They're very sad to see us leave from an economic viewpoint because of the amount of money that we pour into the local economies here in Baden, Solingen, and also in Lahr. But I mean, they realize that it is proper, I believe, and but we will certainly leave many, many friends behind, and I think relations between Canada and Germany will continue. It's been a superb experience, and I think we can march out holding our heads very high.
November 1992. Members of the Baden alumni, people who served on the base for over 40 years, attend the final reunion parade. It was a war they fought at Baden, one of the longest, most terrifying wars ever. Yet victory was not so much at the cost of lives as the saving of them. There were those who fell, victims of chance or human error, unforgiven. They gave everything for victory, a fragile peace preserved. It is victory being celebrated here. For the first time in history, war confronted humankind with extinction. These Canadians, all Canadians, fought against it and won. Through NATO, through changes in government, through 4 full generations, we kept the peace and delivered freedom to untold millions. Now, the Cold Warriors are coming home.